Hey, Coach Adam back here for the second class within the MOVE module for the Essentials of Health and Wellness Google Classroom. This second class is going to go over resistance training. Now, for resistance training, we have three primary learning objectives. We would like you, the learner, to be able to recognize the benefits of resistance training to improve your health, wellness, and fitness. We'd also like you, the learner, to be able to classify how to effectively resistance training for differing goals. Finally, we'd like you to be able to examine generalized guidelines for all different types of resistance training. So understanding the difference between what does it mean to, let's say, train for hypertrophy or strength or endurance, those types of things. I'd like to first start off with the resistance training overview. Like, well, what is resistance training? I think this is important to note because there's a lot of different things that classify as resistance training. It's essentially defined as the body working against a weight, and that weight could be bars, bands, dumbbells, your body weight. It doesn't matter. It's just working against some form of load, even including your body weight. Benefits of resistance training are absolutely vast. These are very supported by research literature as well, and they include improved mental health, improved longevity, improvements in your ability to do just activities of daily life, so like your lifestyle activities, as well as resistance to injury because we're being able to load full ranges of movement across different planes of movement as well. And then finally, you'll also experience better glycemic control and better body composition. Now, what's important is we have different types of resistance training. So our different types of resistance training include stability, endurance, hypertrophy, strength, and power. We're going to talk about those more in a bit. We also need to understand the different variables that go into overall training. So it's not just resistance training, but it's also conditioning. It's also those other types of modalities that we can utilize and implement as well. Our overall variables with a specific scope of resistance training include the first things first. We got to know what you're training for. That's called our needs analysis. What do you want to improve? Because, for example, if someone came to you or you as a individual wanted to improve your max bench press, and you said, let's do sets of 30 on bicep curls, you'd be like, well, that doesn't make a ton of sense, right? Because it's probably not very specific to our overall goal of improving my 1 repetition maximum on a bench press. It doesn't make a lot of sense. So that is the principle called specificity. Your body adapts to what you ask of it to do. It's called the specific adaptations to impose demands, said principle. And that is essentially going along with your needs analysis. When I ask you, what do you want to improve? What are you training for? If I'm training for a physical fitness assessment, or if I'm training for the ability to play with my kids for the rest of my life, so I want to be able to do general sports and activities, well, those are different goals. And those, of course, then mean that you needed to train a little differently to achieve those goals. That falls in alignment with specificity. Your body is going to continue to adapt to the demands that you ask of it. So you need to do things in your physical activity on a daily and weekly basis that are actually improving your efforts to achieve your overall goals in your needs analysis. That is done, of course, through different ways. First being exercise selection. So again, if you want to get better at a bench press and I tell you to do a bunch of bicep curls, well, it's probably not going to make a lot of sense because that's not very specific. I'm not selecting the right exercise to get you better at the thing you want to get better at, right? So for exercise selection is what exercises actually work toward me achieving my goals. That's exercise selection. Then after exercise selection, we need to start to structure those exercises in a logical and sequential order within a workout and across time. So for our exercise order is how to structure those exercises within a session. We typically like to recommend doing your compound movements first, which are things like your core movements like squat, deadlift, bench press, pull-ups, shoulder press, those kind of fundamental movement patterns we covered in the first class. Doing those things as your first and second movements of the day, doing those earlier in the workout, definitely helps to achieve a sufficient stimulus for my body to actually adapt. So then exercise order follows that with starting with some compound movements and then getting into maybe some simpler movements, maybe like isolation movements, like a bicep curl or like a tricep pushdown, or doing specific direct core work for like your abs, or doing chopping movements, those types of things. Exercise order is achieved by starting with the thing you want to get better at first. And so if we want to get better at, let's say, our bench press, and I start my workout with squatting and then deadlifting and then shoulder press, and then I do bench press fourth, well, that doesn't make a lot of sense to structure the workout that way, because it's not falling in alignment with what do I want to get better at. So exercise order definitely matters, even if we choose the right exercises. So the next piece is our intensity and volume. Intensity is essentially how hard you're going to push, and then volume is for how long. So with resistance training scope, intensity is how much weight are you going to be able to use. We have two primary types of intensity, which include absolute intensity and relative intensity, where absolute intensity is essentially just how much weight you're going to use, right? So an absolute intensity of 100 pounds is no matter who you are in a group workout setting, let's say, you're going to use 100 pounds. That's absolute intensity. But for our relative intensity, if I ask you to, let's say, do 75% effort or 80% of your estimated 1 rep max, well, that's a relative intensity relative to your abilities. For volume, a lot of times that's tracked based off of how many sets we do, of how many repetitions at whatever intensity we select. Now, what's important to note is the relationship between intensity and volume. We'll talk about this more on a future slide, but essentially, intensity and volume are sort of inversely related with one another. So the heavier I lift, well, the less total volume I'm likely going to be able to do. Because if I ask you to do 90% of your 1 rep max, let's say your 1 rep max on back squat is 200 pounds, and I ask you to do 180 pounds, well, you might be able to do that for a max effort set of, let's say, 3 reps. If I ask you to do that for sets of 2 reps for 50 sets, well, that's 100 reps total. But that's very different than if I ask you to do a bodyweight squat for 2 sets of 50. That's also 100 repetitions. So it's similar in terms of my repetitions completed, but goodness gracious, is that quite a bit of a different workout, because the intensity of that back squat workout is so much drastically higher than doing an air squat, like a bodyweight squat. So we need to make sure we pay attention to the intensity and volume relationship regardless of what we're doing, so that we can actually work toward, again, achieving our goals identified in our needs analysis. And then finally, how much rest do we need between sets? We'll talk about that more on our final table, but that's what our final training variable is for resistance training. And I think the last piece, in bold and underlined, is the main question that we need to ask ourselves anytime we go into a training session, regardless if that's conditioning or resistance training. What's the goal stimulus? Is the goal stimulus to improve strength? Is the goal stimulus to improve my muscle endurance? Is it, to improve power? What am I trying to get better at in this program, in this week of training, or in this day of training? If you just want to be focused on getting a good quality stimulus for your training session today, that's a different intended goal stimulus than if I'm working with someone who wants to get better for a competition a year from now. It's a different intended goal stimulus. So we need to ask ourselves, before we go into any physical activity or physical endeavor, what's the goal of this workout? If I can identify that goal, I can use my knowledge of these training variables to adjust based off of whatever changes may happen at any time, based off of when I go, let's say, to the gym. Someone's using the machine that I want to use, and they just started. Okay, well, if I know the goal of stimulus is to achieve a hamstring isolation movement for this next exercise, well, then I know I can go switch and pick something else, because I can still achieve that goal stimulus by doing a different movement pattern. And so by identifying the goal stimulus, we can improve our understanding and application of these training variables for any resistance training program, whether that's a beginner, intermediate, or advanced training program. So it's also worth noting, talking about how to warm up for resistance training specifically. We'll talk about conditioning training in the next class, but for resistance training specifically, when we think about how do we get prepared to lift on any given day or complete a resistance training session on any given day. Now, what's important for our warm-up for resistance training is likely it's still best to complete some form of a general warm-up. Our general warm-up, we lead from general to specific, or slow to fast, or simple to complex. So doing things like our gradual general warm-up, let's say going for a 3 to 5 minute jog, or hopping on an Airdyne or assault bike for 3 to 5 minutes. That's a solid way to kind of, what I like to say is, let's just get hot and sweaty. You're just going to get hot and sweaty. That's a great way to start. That's our general warm-up. But if I went from, let's say, 3 to 5 minutes on an Echo bike, and then I tried to go hit a heavy set of bench press, well, I'm not really prepared for the first exercise of that day. So what we need to do is get general to specific. So for example, in the photo, if you can see, if you have the slides pulled up, our general warm-up within this AI program dropdown is 2 rounds of 1 minute on the Echo bike, doing 20 meters of a walking quad stretch, a high knee pull, and then a walking lunge and a twist. That's kind of getting my body going through some different ranges of motion, right? Getting my body prepared for exercise, and I'm getting hot and sweaty. But then that doesn't stop there. Our warm-up continues on the high bar back squat. Let's say we're working up to something heavy for the day, right? Well, I probably need to do some lighter effort on the back squat as I get prepared to hit my heavier set. So if I'm working up to something heavy, if I'm trying to do heavy resistance training as my goal for that day, as my goal stimulus, well, then I probably need to do some sets of back squat, getting prepared gradually heavier and heavier over the course of 2 to 6 sets, getting ready to do my heaviest set. That's our specific warm-up. So going general to specific includes getting prepared for that first exercise, or getting prepared for whatever you're actually going to do within your overall session. Now, by doing this, by warming up appropriately, and it's always worth warming up regardless of how much time you have, you should absolutely include a warm-up in any training effort that you have, because warm-ups can help you to resist injury, prime the body for your daily session, and you can absolutely improve your performance on that session. So if you just went in and tried to go hit that heavy set of back squat right away with no warm-up, it's very unlikely that you will have a better performance than if you went through a full general and specific warm-up. And then finally, a way I like to think about warming up, maybe if we're doing a group resistance training workout, or if you're preparing for one yourself, a way I like to think about the warm-up is, if it's done effectively, you are blending the gap or the line between where does the warm-up end and where does the workout begin. Because if I go general to specific, I hit my general warm-up and then I get more and more specific. Well, at what point does my workout actually begin? Well, it's likely during that first challenging set. But if I had an onlooker watching me, do a warm-up, or, getting ready for a workout, it's going to be kind of hard to tell the difference between where my warm-up ended and when my workout began, because I got more and more specific getting prepared for my goal stimulus for that first exercise of that training session. Now, let's say we finish the activity. We finish those training variables. We put together a good activity, and then we go into a cool down. Now, a cool down includes a lot of different things. So we'll talk about this a bit more in a future lecture as well, but static stretching, foam rolling, or self-myofascial release, and breath work, injury resistance, those are all different forms of cool downs. We'll go kind of one by one. Static stretching after workout could be done, and it may help to improve your overall flexibility over time, because my muscles are already warm and primed to potentially have a better effect for static stretching. But what's most important to note for static stretching is that you're not going to achieve a stimulus that's sufficient enough for actual change if you do 10 seconds of an arm stretch, or if I try to touch my toes for 5 seconds. It's not enough time to actually send a signal to my body to change. So for static stretching, we'd like to see upwards of roughly 30 to 90 seconds in that static stretching range of motion for there to actually be a sufficient amount of stimulus for your body to change. So essentially, for static stretching, that's probably the number one mistake that we all see, is people do it for an insufficient amount of time. So if you're going to achieve static stretching, let's say that you want to improve your overall flexibility, great, absolutely go for it. And doing it at the end of a workout is a great time to include it. But don't do it for a set of 10 seconds. Do it for a little longer. Try to seek 30, 60, 90 seconds of total static stretching on every single stretch that you complete. because that's a way that will give our body enough of a stimulus to actually change. Secondly, this is also included in Health in 100 Words, is self-myofascial release, one specific type of that being foam rolling. Foam rolling can also help and be a great thing at the end of a workout. It may reduce overall muscular soreness. It might help you feel a little bit better or improve your transition from ending a workout, going back into activities of daily life. Or if it just feels good for you and you feel better after you foam roll, by all means, include it during the cool down of your resistance training session. Go for it. It can absolutely help. Another one that could also help or work is breath work. We have two kind of primary ones that are kind of easy to explain, but there's a lot of different types of breathing sequences or breath work sort of strategies that you can implement. Two of these include box breathing or resonance breathing. Box breathing is essentially drawing a mental image of a box in your brain, right? So if we have going up is inhale, and then we pause, and then going down is exhaling, and then we pause is sort of completing that box. You could do this for sets of, let's say, 3 seconds on each leg of that box, or you could do this for 4 or 5 or 6 or 7. There's no real magic to what number you pick. Just do something that generally helps you sort of help calm down after a workout. Because most resistance training workouts are going to be intense enough that your body is sort of in this fight or flight stage, right? We need to turn ourselves a little bit back down, right? We need to kind of down regulate a little bit at the end of that workout to transition back into like a rest and digest sort of state. And breath work is one way that we can do that, specifically box breathing. So we could do that through, let's say, choosing 4. We inhale for 4 seconds, pause for 4 seconds, exhale for 4, pause for 4. And that would be a complete box. And we could do that for 5 breaths, 10 breaths, 1 breath, whatever you have time for, but that can actually help us to calm down at the end of a workout and again, transition back into our rest and digest system. Another one is resonance breathing. It's where we kind of have this deep inhale and then a much slower exhale and a pause after the exhale. So let's say, for example, 3 seconds inhale, 6 seconds exhale, and then a 6-second pause. Again, there's not really a ton of like magic to these numbers. Do something that makes sense for you and you feel better after you do it. But give it a quick try. Inhale deeply for 3 seconds, exhale for 6, and then pause after that exhale for 6 more and see how you feel. Even 1 breath can make enough of a difference to calm myself back down. It might work after a workout, but it could also work during your daily life. So it's worth noting. Now, finally, our injury resistance additions. So we have reactive adaptability and proactive adaptability. Reactive adaptability is essentially you're reacting to what's happening in our daily life. Let's say whenever I'm going through a workout, my hip starts to feel a little weird when I'm doing a lunge. Okay, well, maybe I'm going to go hop on the foam roller for 10 seconds, 20 seconds, 30 seconds on that location and feel a little better. That's kind of being reactive to how my body's responding to what I'm asking it to do on that day. A proactive response might be, hey, when I'm doing physical therapy or when I'm rehabilitating from some form of injury or tweak, let's say I'm going to do these different exercises like, side lying leg raises or monster walks or hip airplanes. Well, doesn't it probably make sense to also include those in my general training sessions? Because it might actually contribute to hopefully resisting the fact that my body might get injured in that way in the future. Well, yeah, I'd say so. It probably makes a lot of sense to train stability, muscular endurance in those ways so we can decrease the likelihood for us to get injured overall. That's sort of our injury resistance additions, and that's one form of proactive adaptability, is sort of including those exercises on a daily basis so that hopefully we reduce the chances that we get hurt in the first place. Now, finally, this is what I affectionately call my sort of ish table. And the reason why I say that is we have a sort of process called paralysis by analysis. I don't want you to overthink. I don't want you to overthink and say, well, I'm just not going to go to the gym because I don't know what to do, or I don't know how many sets to do, or I don't know how many reps to do. Just generally moving your body is probably going to be a better thing. Now, of course, we don't want to overtrain or do too much too quick. That's how we increase the likelihood for injury, is doing too much, too quick, too heavy, too fast, those types of things. So we definitely want to increase our movement as a gradual basis. But if we follow sort of these general guidelines, we can achieve that in a better fashion. So first, Muscular endurance. We can also think about muscular endurance somewhat improving our stability. That more matters on our exercise selection. But for muscular endurance, you're doing one or more sets. Because, for example, it's still muscular endurance if I do one set of 100 on sit-ups. That's still muscle endurance. But it's also muscle endurance if I do 10 sets of 10 on sit-ups. Well, that's also muscle endurance. It's the same number of repetitions, but it's spread over more sets, which makes sense, right? So for our repetitions, generally to train muscle endurance, it's around 8-ish or more, right? For our rest time, you're resting somewhere between roughly 10 to 60 seconds. And then you're probably around 70% of your estimated 1 rep max for that movement or less, a little lower, right? Because that puts us into an appropriate repetition range that we're able to complete. Because you can't do 90% of your 1 rep max for a set of 20. You can't really train muscle endurance at 90% of your 1 rep max because that's just generally not muscle endurance. You might be able to do that for 3 or 4 reps. So it's unlikely you'll be able to actually train muscle endurance. Now for final notes on muscle endurance, higher repetitions per set mean doing less sets. My example of a set of sit-ups, if I'm trying to get better at sit-ups, I could do 10 sets of 10 with 20 seconds of rest between, and that's 100 repetitions total. But if I did 10 sets of 100, well, I probably couldn't do that, and I'm going to need to do less sets. So if I do one set of 100, or if I do 2 sets of 50, well, it's less sets, but I'm still achieving a sufficient amount of volume for my body to adapt and respond to that stimulus without going overboard, okay? Now, additionally, you can also lower your rest time and do more sets. So like I said, 10 sets of 10 with 20 seconds rest. That's lower rest time, but it's more sets and less repetitions per set. An example of what that might look like if I'm training for a physical fitness assessment might be something like an every minute on the minute set. So an EMOM for 12 minutes at 8 reps on push-ups. If I told you to do 8 reps of push-ups, you might not think that's muscle endurance. But if you do that for 12 sets, for example, well, it gets to be muscle endurance pretty daggone quick. Another example might be as many repetitions as possible within 5 minutes of doing 2 push-ups and then 2 sit-ups and then 4 push-ups and then 4 sit-ups and then 6 and 6, 8 and 8, and so on and so forth, going up by 2 on each exercise for 5 minutes straight. Now again, we might say 2 push-ups and 2 sit-ups is not muscle endurance, and I agree if that was the only piece we were doing. But if I do that with the only rest on push-ups is while I'm doing sit-ups, and I'm getting higher and higher repetitions, and I do that for 5 minutes, well again, it gets to be muscle endurance pretty quickly. So there's a lot of ways we can be creative with this, and that's again why I say don't think about these in absolute terms. Think about the general stimulus, the general goal stimulus for any given training session. Now for our next one, muscle hypertrophy. Muscle hypertrophy is also kind of thinking about like muscle size, right? So how big our muscles are is muscle hypertrophy. But maybe if you're a male or female who doesn't want to put on muscle or doesn't want to put on a lot of additional body weight, we can still train within muscle hypertrophy and not put on body weight. Especially if you're a beginner or an intermediate, it's worth noting that you can absolutely put on muscle and lose fat at the same time. It can absolutely be done with high quality execution of the 5 factors of health. High quality sleep, high quality nutrition, and high quality training can definitely improve your body composition while maintaining the same body weight on the scale, for example, but still putting on more muscle and losing more fat. You can do that through training for muscle size or muscle hypertrophy, okay? So when we think about the sets, reps, and rest for hypertrophy, you want to think probably somewhere around 2 to 6 sets, depending on how experienced you are with those movements. Probably somewhere around 6 to 12-ish reps for, or about 0 to 3 repetitions in reserve, which we'll talk about in a second. For your rest time is roughly 45 seconds to 3 minutes. Again, depends on the exercise selection. If I'm doing muscle hypertrophy as a training stimulus for bicep curls, well, I'm going to rest a lot less for a bicep curl to recover than if I'm doing muscle hypertrophy for a back squat. I'm probably going to want a little bit more rest for that back squat, okay? And then finally, for muscle hypertrophy, you're around 65 to 85% of your 1 rep max-ish, again, on average. That's given that you're working at a high relative intensity. So if I'm doing, let's say my max on a bench press is 100 pounds, and I'm doing 65 pounds. Well, let's say I might be able to do 65 pounds for a set of 15 repetitions, but I'm doing sets of 3 or sets of 6, but I could do 15. Well, that's not a high enough relative intensity. It's not near failure at all, not even close. So if I'm doing that, it's not a sufficient relative intensity to give my body enough of a response to say, hey, you should get better, you should get stronger, you should put on more muscle, right? So what we need to think about is training at a high level of relative intensity and a low repetitions in reserve. So when we think about the notes, repetitions in reserve is, again, if I said 65 pounds, you can do that for 15 reps. If you do 12 reps, well, then you'll have 3 repetitions in reserve. If I tell you to do 75 pounds for 1 RIR or 1 repetition in reserve, let's say that you could have done 10, so you'll stop at 9. That is a high enough relative intensity, and it's at the sufficient weight that's necessary for muscle hypertrophy to occur, and you're doing it in the relatively appropriate repetition range, so you'll definitely see some improvements by doing those types of things. But if you're way outside the ballpark range of roughly 0 to 4 repetitions in reserve, then you're probably not going to give your body enough of a hypertrophy stimulus to see a dramatic change, okay? So the only other notes worth noting for muscle hypertrophy is, generally speaking, lifting to 0 RIR, or what we would say lifting to failure, on maybe the final set is okay, but it's probably not the best to do it for every single set or train every set to failure, because it increases the likelihood that we're going to overtrain or maybe not really functionally, or run the risk of overreaching a little bit too much in our training sessions, and we might actually increase our injury likelihood. But if we can train with roughly 1 to 3 repetitions in reserve, we'll get a hard enough training session for my body to adapt, and I'll prevent myself from having really reduced performance throughout the rest of the workout. So that does it for muscle hypertrophy. Now we'll look at muscle strength. For muscle strength is my body's ability to produce a maximum amount of force. We're looking at about, again, 1 to 6-ish sets, doing 1 to 5-ish repetitions, and then resting for about 2 to 5 minutes between sets at about 85 to 100% of your estimated 1 rep max. Now, you can see we've gone from a little bit lower rest to a little more to quite a bit more. And that's the reason why, is because those are such fatiguing sets. It's a different, what we call, energy system. So our body producing max force from muscle strength versus producing force or completing work and muscle endurance is a different task. My body's going to recover a little faster when I'm doing muscle endurance than it will if I'm doing muscle strength. So if I'm doing muscle strength, I want to take my time a little bit more in between sets, because it's a lot harder for that system to recover faster. Okay, so for muscle strength, training maximum strength, if I'm training maximum strength in a group setting, if you're doing this at group PT and you do rest for 30 seconds, well, it's probably not really training muscle or maximum strength at that point. We're probably training a little bit more muscle endurance at that point. So definitely be mindful of how heavy you need to lift and thinking about what are the required rest times for muscle strength as an actual stimulus. The other things that are important to note is, for muscle strength, you can certainly use what we call a top set. So you can work up to something heavy, let's say for 1 set of 5 at a, maybe 80% of your 1 rep max. Maybe that's heavy for you, great. You work up to 1 set of 5, and then I do 2 back-off sets of 10. So I'm kind of blending a little bit of muscle strength and a little bit of muscle size training within the same session. And that's a totally fine approach. So you can still get definitely a lot stronger by doing a top set with a couple of what we call back-off sets. Now, that might also enhance your strength stimulus and reduce your injury risk, because you're lifting at a very high load or very high absolute intensity for yourself for a little less period of time, a bit fewer sets. And then you're going to go into your assistance work, maybe do some conditioning, after that, and so on. But that allows you to be a little bit more flexible by still achieving a strength stimulus, but not so much so that it is, the only thing you're able to do on that day at a sufficient level of intensity. Now, finally, for muscle power, you're looking at about 3 to 6-ish sets, 1 to 10-ish repetitions, at about 2 to 5 minutes of rest as well, and about 10% body weight if we're doing this for something like an external load, like a medicine ball. And then if it's a barbell, like an Olympic lift or a trap bar jump, well, that's going to depend on your overall ability and depends on what lift you're going to select. But generally, we'll see max force outputs somewhere between 30 to 60%-ish of our 1 rep max. But again, if I'm trying to train for Olympic lifting, like a clean or a snatch, well, it's going to be quite a bit higher because we're still training for a 1 repetition max for Olympic lifting, but it's going to be a little bit different for an approach. So that gets a little bit outside the scope of essentials of health and wellness. So we'll leave that for a future conversation. But for muscle power training, the ability to produce maximum force in as little time as possible, we definitely need to think a lot about doing body weight stuff like power or jumping movements, right? We could do sprinting movements. We could even attach a sled behind you with maybe 5 or 10% of your body weight as a recommended load for attaching a sled behind me if I'm trying to get better at sprinting to improve a 40-yard dash, right? Another way to do it would be training for barbell or power sports like football or hockey or basketball. Doing those kind of things, it kind of depends on the lift again, right? So lifting loads fast, it might be around 60 to 80% or so, but other lifts might be 30 to 45% of your 1 rep max for max speed. If you want to train a little bit more specifics for muscle power or for sports performance, definitely reach out to your GRIT CSCS, and then we can talk about that a little further with you. But that kind of wraps it up for muscle power. Essentially, what we'd like to think is for health in 100 words, and just doing this as part of my general physical activity, you should just think about considering including things like a box jump or a broad jump or some form of sprinting or lateral movements or agility types of things, or lifting heavy weight pretty fast within your daily or weekly physical activity plan. And that's a great way to approach incorporating muscle power into my general physical activity. And so that does it for our resistance training module. Our next class is on conditioning training. I will see you when you get there.